Yeah, thank you so much. We need to start. Hello and welcome everyone. We are very pleased to have you today, and we are also very pleased to have our keynote speaker, Professor Salwa Ismail, who will be giving a talk today with the title, The Politics and Matter of Livable Lives in the Middle East. I believe that many of you already know Professor Ismail and know her work, her contribution to the field of Middle Eastern studies and the impact of that work. However, I still want to introduce her in very few minutes, which I believe would be somehow a difficult task, taking into consideration the volume and significance of her work and publications. So Professor Ismail is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS. She has tens of publications. Some of the main research interests of her include, but not limited to, Islamism and Islamist politics in the Middle East, as well as, more lately, urbanism in the Middle East region, with a special focus on Egypt and Syria. What makes the work of Professor Ismail very special to me is that it brings together the rigor of research and high academic quality work with the feeling of responsibility of the scholar and the academic towards the marginalized people of our region. And in this regard, I would like to mention, if I am to choose one of her works, I would choose her book, The Role of Violence, Subjectivity, Memory, and Government in Syria. This book was a life-saving text for me when I was doing my PhD thesis, which, since we are on this topic, I was very honored to have Professor Ismail as my PhD examiner, and I will always be indebted to her for the valuable feedback and bright insights that she gave me at the time. I really recommend looking at that book and at her work in general. Everyone, please welcome Professor Salwa.
Thank you, Wassim, for these very kind words and really wonderful introduction. I'm touched and honored. I'm touched and honored to be here this evening. I want to thank the organizers of the conference. I want to thank Professor Simon Maybon, Professor Neve Gordon, Dr. Rosa Sansoni, and Dr. Wassim Naboulsi, and all the BRISMES team for inviting me and for making my coming here today possible. I'm also just really, truly grateful and honored to be speaking to you at this time, a very difficult and dark time. My talk today, while it's not about Palestine, it's my thinking about the topic is impacted by what's going on in Palestine. Because I think what's going on in Palestine is extreme of a global condition. We can all identify because while, yes, we don't see the killings that we see in Palestine everywhere, but there are the elements of destruction and predation that we see in Palestine. We see that in many places of the world. And I will be talking about this, the destruction and predation that we see in many places in the Middle East and North Africa, but also we see across the globe in so many places. So it's global South, also global North. So the title of my talk is The Politics of Matter, the politics and matter of livable lives in the Middle East and North Africa. If it was in North Africa, I was not there, just because the society is the Middle East, but really it should be the Middle East and North Africa. In this talk, I would like to discuss how everyday life politics in the Middle East, as in much of the global South, has as primary concern making life livable and fending off apparatuses and practices of power that render life unlivable, or at least undermine and hinder livability. So how do we understand livability to begin with? My formulation of the concept of livability draws on Judith Butler's work on precarious life and livable life. It is also situated on an analytical terrain that is charted by Fanon's writings on colonialism's practices of rendering abject the colonized, or rendering the colonized abject, Agamben's meditation on bare life, Foucault's writings on biopolitics, Mbembe's conception of necropolitics, and Didier Fassin's theorization of the politics of life as such. On this analytical terrain, and grounded in ethnographic work on everyday life politics in the Middle East and North Africa, my objective is to bring to focus the materialities, that is, the physical substances, objects, and non-human entities implicated in making a livable life and in producing conditions of livability and unlivability. My starting point is an understanding of livable life as a life worth living, which can be extended to mean a life lived in community with others and upholding the norms of human dignity. Matter is at the heart of the conditions of livability, the conditions that are necessary but not sufficient in and of themselves to make life worth living. Food, shelter, water, means of sanitation, means of mobility are all necessary conditions of life. The properties of such matter, the terms of their presence or lack, and the forms of their governance, that is, their political materiality, have a bearing on the kind of life made possible. For example, if such matter appears in degraded form, as in toxic food produce or polluted water, a risk to life arises. In an affective register, the degradation of habitation and the built environment act on its inhabitants by eliciting a sense of abjection and diminishment. In this light, the necessary requirements of life, the material conditions of life, tie closely and can be constitutive of norms of livability and unlivability, that is, norms such as dignity, respect, and recognition. So in this talk, I want to address how ordinary people struggle in the everyday to make a bid for a livable life, and how matter is implicated in this struggle. This exploration of the political materiality of everyday life politics brings into view practices of power and projects of government and governmental conduct that by design and inner logic make life unlivable. I draw here on ethnographic studies of everyday life politics in various settings across the region, in particular Egypt, Syria, and Morocco. It's important to acknowledge that the broader context of this exploration is contemporary coloniality, global capitalism, and global apartheid. I have 5 interrelated propositions that I will be exploring in this, I'm developing my exploration of the politics of matter and livable life around. The first proposition, one of the propositions advanced here, concerns the materialities of the conditions necessary for livable life, and hence a politics of matter should be given close consideration in the conceptualization of the politics of life. As noted, I just noted now, negation or diminishment of livability could be brought about by materialities that undermine the preservation of humanness. For example, degraded or non-existent sanitation, inadequate shelter that disallow privacy and intimacy, inaccessible or absent means of mobility. Abjection arises as an effective quality and relation of the material conditions marked by degradation, decay, and destruction. My second proposition is that matter is implicated in governmental projects. A body of anthropological studies on infrastructure has shown how techniques of discipline and regulation are inscribed in technical arrangements, design, and materialities of infrastructural systems. My third proposition is that the interplay of political materialities of struggle for a livable life on one hand, and forms of power and modalities of violence that are productive of unlivability on the other, must be viewed within a political economy of global capitalism, within structures of exploitation and dispossession, and within processes and practices of hierarchization of human worth, creating conditions of abandonment and destruction. Fourth, hierarchies of human worth established through the differential allocation of worth and legitimacy of human life, for example, with categories of population designated as superfluous and disposable, materialize in projects of government that have as their objective the disassembly of ways of life, dispossession, and destruction. Finally, and this is kind of an overall and comes out of these different propositions, the politics of ordinary people, of the everyday, unfolds within and against the materialization of the differential allocation of human worth, of precarity, and of worthiness. Making a bid for life in spaces of relegation and abandonment is political. It is a struggle against abjection and for dignity, for a life worth living. So I want to start by just making some outlining some ideas about how I conceptualize, or the kind of conceptualization of livable life that I'm articulating, drawing on Butler's work and others. Butler's theorization of livability and unlivability is premised on the social ontology of life, that is, an understanding of life as inherently social. The sociality of life, I quote Butler here, conditions every relation the subject may have to their existence. Butler underscores that one's life is not exclusively one's own, but dependent on others. Relations of dependence underpin the precariousness of life. Importantly, it is within specific social and historical contexts, permeated by relations of power, that differential distribution of precariousness manifests as embodied precarity, that is, precarity of the life that is attached to a body. It follows that the conditions productive of precarity put the body in question. A livable life is dependent on bodily persistence, on physical survival. So what is a livable life? So even though a livable life is dependent on bodily persistence in all thinking is not sufficient for a life worth living. But I want to say that, particularly in the contemporary times, bodily persistence is not only essential, but is actually very much implicated in the making of a life worth living, because the struggles for persistence, for physical persistence, are also productive of struggles for a livable life. They're intimately connected. But I want to kind of go back to some of the distinctions that are being drawn between the bodily life as opposed to something that exceeds it in theoretical writings, in order to kind of counter the arguments that a life that is centered or that has a primary concern with persistence is not political and cannot be seen as a life worth living. And that the good life is, in classical thinking and much of contemporary thinking, is thought to be a kind of centered on a certain form of political agency, and is also thought to be contemplative, as in the writing of someone like Hannah Arendt, for example. And of course, that has a kind of a longer history and tradition going back to classical Greek thought. So just to consider the terms of the distinctions that are drawn between good life and bad life in various philosophical traditions and debates helps us gain insights into thinking about the politics of livable life. In many of these traditions, we have a dualistic framework of life where there is an opposition between good life and bad life, and this opposition is articulated in terms of the opposition between bodily life and more than bodily life. A life that is reduced to mere bodily survival in early modern Western thought is a bad life, akin to a life in servitude. This verdict finds resonance in contemporary propositions on bare life as a negation of political activity. The biopolitics of the concentration or prison camp appears as a form of modern slavery. In this thinking, lesser life is marked by concern with the body as the thing that keeps it alive. Lesser life manifests as negative survival, life defined by mere fact of existence and not by qualities beyond that. In other words, it's a life that is more bodily than ethical or qualified. In this opposition, struggles for physical existence are assumed to be outside of politics, not meeting the ideals of contemplative and active life. If a good life, or a life that's worth living, is more than mere bodily existence, many of the conditions necessary for life are requirements of bodily persistence, of physical survival. Conditions such as food, shelter, and mobility. Survival is required to live, and self-evidently, but not sufficient to create a livable life, a life led in community with others. At the same time, struggles for livable life by necessity include struggles for what allows the body to persist. But in adopting a dualistic framework of bodily life versus more than bodily life, adopting that occludes the body-centered politics of life and the interconnections that this politics of life has with the politics of livable life. This is really what I'm trying to advance here, is the interconnection between the body-centered struggles for physical survival, and the struggles for a meaningful life, a life worth living, a life lived with others, a life that upholds the norms of human dignity. What kind of politics of life do we then need to recognize? My response to this question resonates with the arguments put by Didier Fassin. Fassin notes that in the kind of opposition posited between biological life and political life, found in the writings of Arendt and Agamben, the possibility of a politics of life is discounted, either as not. So this opposition, positive between biological life and political life, found in Agamben and Arendt, in that opposition, the possibility of a politics of life is discounted either as not politics, for being of a base or lower domain that sits beneath and outside contemplative life for Arendt, or as life too bare as to enable the possibility of active agency for Agamben. So approaching the struggles for the material conditions of life as integral to the bid for a livable life recovers physical survival as a realm of politics. In contrast to Agamben's bare life as a negation of politics, from this prism, struggles for physical survival are not devoid of value or ethics. Rather, they are generative of meaning and value and constitutive of a domain of politics. Deprivations of the material conditions of survival obstruct and hinder the possibility of making life worth living. Conceptualizations of such deprivations as bare life, in conceptualizations of such deprivations as bare life, there is an implicit dismissal of the politics of survival. The struggles for physical survival should be included in the bid for a livable life. Even in the sphere of negation or destruction and deprivation, The subject's struggle for survival must be viewed as a bid for life and a livable life. The bid is political and integral to the carving out of spaces of livability. The struggle is against the life that cannot be endured, the life that is unlivable in non-life and abject life. As argued by Wassim, struggles for survival are struggles for life to be lived fully with all its possibilities and potentialities. They're not just about clinging to physical life as preferable to death or holding on to a miserable life so as to maintain biological survival as the ultimate goal. Rather, the politics of survival are intimately enmeshed in the bid to make a livable life, a life worth living. In some respects, these struggles are fundamental to the politics of livable life. Wassim brings to attention socio-political struggles that have biological life as their object, and that escape the binary of political life versus biological life. This analytic framework proceeds from a proposition that Foucault made in the History of Sexuality in the first volume. And the proposition is that modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. In other words, life as physical existence has become the object of politics, and more specifically of rationalities and technologies of government. Now, Wassim says that Foucault, by focusing on technologies of government and rationalities of government, ends up giving a backseat to the politics of life as such, to actually the struggles for to maintain the biological life, to maintain physical existence, and also the forms of power that undermine biological, physical life. And really what we need to do is look at the norms that underpin the rationalities and the technologies of government. These norms are productive of this differential allocation of value and worth. So underneath the technologies and rationalities of governments are also norms that says some lives are worth protecting and some lives are not. And we have to look at the norms that are behind this differential allocation of worth to some lives and the withdrawal of worth from other lives. So that's one element of the politics of life as such. But there is another element, and that is the struggle of those who are confronted by the forms of power that undermine their physical persistence, survival, and of course, that undermine the possibility of a life worth living. The realms of neglect, abandonment, and castaway are political because the neglected, the abandoned, and the castaway struggle to overcome. This struggle can be found in paradigmatic conditions of abjection and degradation, manifest in subjugation through servitude, imprisonment, and wars of destruction. I'm sure we can all see how much there is of politics and there is of a struggle for both physical survival and livable life in Palestine, even in the most horrifying conditions of destruction and annihilation. So in the mere struggle for survival, there is politics, but that is enmeshed in a struggle for a life worth living. They're not separate. So one of the paradigmatic cases that I saw this struggle taking place comes from the Syrian detention camps and prisons and the diaries of political prisoners there. particularly from Tadmor prison. Wassim nods because he knows the details of that. The Tadmor was also a horrifying kind of a concentration camp, imprisonment camp, in which thousands perished and in which utter degradation to the political prisoners happened on a daily basis for years and years. But in the accounts of the political prisoners, we still see that there was a struggle to maintain humanity through very small acts of nurturing courage, personal courage, and even creating implements of life that were denied in the prisons, and so on. And there were many arts of living that, in conditions of utter degradation, the inmates, the detainees, managed to engage in. We also see in the degraded living environments of so-called slum settlements, inhabitants confront these conditions through a multitude of strategies, and in the process, ways of being and doing are fashioned. So even in spaces of abandonment, survival struggles unfold acts of making a life worth living. Everyday life politics is increasingly occupied with conditions of life: shelter, water, and sanitation. In this politics of life, struggle for physical survival connects with struggle for good life. So before I give you more concrete, and I know maybe some of you find this maybe too theoretical, before I give more concrete examples, I want to just underscore that power is, that we need to bring into view also the question of power in thinking about livability and unlivability. To reframe the politics of ordinary people as being about making lives livable requires a critical examination of the apparatuses, practices, and processes that produce unlivability or hinder the possibility of a livable life. This is an undertaking to interrogate how lives are organized and managed through governmental and non-governmental conduct and norms, differentiated and differentially exposed to precarity. This interrogation is connected with the sphere of biopolitics as the sphere that, and I quote Butler, establishes measures for the differential allocation of life itself. The differentiation is produced in and through relations of power, apparatuses of government and control, and practices and mechanisms that enact the worth and legitimacy attached to the living life. Unlivability is always within the political, and it is what defines the terms and stakes of the political. The management of the conditions of livability, basic living conditions, are increasingly governmentalized, that is, governed by rationalities and techniques with intended outcomes and objectives. This governmentalization entwines with a political economy of neoliberalism, setting the rules and terms of access to the materialities of life within an alignment of market logic understood in terms of profit and accumulation. So now I want to move into more concrete discussion of how actually we see the struggles for livability and how political materialities are implicated in these struggles. In his account of the colonial town, Fanon sketches conditions of coloniality marked by the materialities of unlivability. The native town stands in opposition to the colonial town, with absence of basic amenities and abject matter permeating the built environment. Fanon's depiction holds for conditions found today across cities of the global south, including the Middle East and North Africa. The opposition between the native town and the colonial city have their counterparts contemporary counterparts in the proliferating spaces of neglect, abandonment, destruction on one hand, and the neighborhoods of wealth, abundance, and affluence of gated communities, exclusive resorts, and global capitals on the other. In context of neglect and abandonment, ordinary peoples making a bid for livable life entail struggles for shelter and for access to basic amenities, such as water and sanitation. In pursuit of these conditions, vast segments of the urban populations and cities across the region, as in much of the global south, engage in auto-construction and self-connection to water pipes, to sanitation networks, and to electrical grids. These efforts embody the political materialities of making a bid for life. They unfold against material conditions of degradation, spatial separation, and surveillance. Ethnographic research in neighborhoods such as Sidi Mu'min in Casablanca, in Dar Salm in Yemen, and in Bulaq al-Dakrur, where I did research more than 20 years ago, relate the politics of life that develop in these everyday struggles for survival, but also for dignity and self-respect, showing the entanglement of matter and affect, matter and senses of self and self-understanding. Making a bid for a livable life was at the heart of the ordinary people's action during the revolutionary mobilizations in Egypt between 2011 and 2014, in Syria's 2011 uprising, in Morocco's multiple and extended episodes of contention in 2011 and 2016-17, in Egypt's popular mobilization collective action, there was this occupation of vacant government-owned buildings in Cairo, and the group active in the occupation called itself Alive in Name Only, underscoring that the recovery of life was conditioned on securing shelter. And indeed, one housing rights activist aptly stated that engaging in the revolution meant being able to pursue in concrete terms the right to housing by squatting in vacant state-owned residential units and forcing a reckoning with government on housing rights. Meanwhile, at the time of the February 2011 movement in Morocco, there was a rumor that unauthorized construction will be sanctioned or will be allowed by the government, and there was a big rush and extended time of informal construction, which again is another expression of this struggle for the right to shelter and an understanding of collective action that it is about, if it will be, there would be engagement in collective action, it will be about these kinds of struggles. It's not going to be about election, democracy, and so on. However understood they are. Also lived experiences of degraded material conditions of shelter and infrastructure were structuring themes in Syrian activists' account of their engagement in the 2011 uprising. Neighborhood-based grievances figured on the list of demands drawn up by leaders and representatives whose mediation was solicited by the Syrian regime. Such lists included reference to the exorbitant energy bills in Banyas, severe rationing of hours of electricity and water consumption in Homs, and perceived discrimination in public sector in most localities. So I want to discuss a certain development that we see more clearly in the period following the revolutions, which I see as a facet of the reconstitution of authoritarianism in the aftermath of the earlier revolutions of 2010, 2011. And this reconstitution emerges in the form of a new phase of technicization of government, linked to a qualitative development in technological capacities, enabling control, surveillance, and intervention into the nooks and crannies of society. As writing on technopolitics have shown, socio-technical systems that are deployed in infrastructural provisions are often designed with the objective of embedding principles of rationalization and abstraction, and to inculcate specific capacities in the subjects of government. So it's against these new forms of government or the kind of the incorporation of certain technologies and socio-technical governance that the struggles for a livable life are unfolding today. And I have two examples here. One is about water governance, and one is about the use of housing or shelter as a kind of an infrastructure of governance. I have 10 minutes, so I'm not sure I'll cover all of that, but I want to, I'll use primarily the water and governance because I think it conveys a lot of the ongoing changes. I think the water governance questions is an illustrative case of the politics of livability, the struggles and contentions over water access and use that are part of the effort to make life livable. Water as an essential matter of life is the object of everyday struggles across various settings in the global south. In these settings, people gain access through complex systems of provision, piped connections, pumps, water tanks, public water taps, or stands. The physical forms and terms of access and quality of water materialize the work of social differentiation and hierarchization. A good number of ethnographic studies of water infrastructure shed light on the socio-material processes that unfold within various systems of water provision. Gaining access to water in urban neighborhoods that develop through auto-construction is often achieved through piped self-connection to the network water grid, collection from public taps, or purchase of water from ambulant water tanks. And these various forms of infrastructural connections materialize a sociality and politics grounded in everyday life, in the everyday life of informal communities and their relations with government. These political materialities unfold in and through collaboration as when people pull together the resources to have connections to the water grid. They're also expressive of gender division of labor. As Farhana Sultana pointed out, most of the collection of water is done by women. And as she pointed out, access to water is a constant struggle. In the case of Dhaka, it's a constant struggle for many informal neighborhoods in the Middle East and in the global south. So I want to use snapshots of governance, of water governance, to have a sense of what's going on in terms of what is being confronted, the practices of power, rationalities of government that are being confronted in trying to access something that is so essential to life, that is water. And I will use, and I have like snapshots of that, and they may seem anecdotal, but I think they are actually, we can find thousands of these anecdotal examples to reconstitute a kind of an understanding of what's going on in terms of something that is so basic. So my first snapshot is from something called Manual for Estimating, Monitoring, and Reporting Water Use in Egypt, which was published or which was available online in 2018, and it was it's an EU-funded manual produced by a consultancy group called LDK Consultants. And the manual is aimed at the systematization and centralization of data collection and water use and cost recovery. The manual sets out a questionnaire, among other things. It covers so much. The manual sets out a questionnaire for household and individual use of water to be administered by Egyptian water authorities at micro-residential level. And the questionnaire asks, among other things, about how many showers are taken and their time frequency, how many times dishes are washed, and how many times toilets are flushed. The lines of inquiry underpin the kind of regulation of water use implemented in South Africa and studied by von Schnitzler. In the South African case, von Schnitzler shows the kind of discipline affected by the alignment of subsidized water rates with the allocation of 30 liters of water per person per day. The discipline of use through water credit limits and graduated tariffs was achieved by means of the targeted population's reduction of the number of time toilets were flushed, reuse of washing water, and similar type practices. The bipolitical materialization of metering and preset water credits in turn elicited an experience of assault on the subject's dignity. My second snapshot comes from how this South African model, we see it kind of work or deployed by a global company, which maybe some of you would know of, Veolia, which was responsible for the introduction of metering in the southwest of England. Veolia is a French corporation which operates across many countries, including North Africa and in Morocco. So Veolia shows up in Morocco as it shows up in many places, introducing prepaid meters for public tap stands. So these public tap stands are actually for the poorest of the poor. But now they are being turned into prepaid meters named Saqaiti. So they're in Rabat, Tangiers, and Tétouan. The rationale behind the installation of this form of water access is that free and open access of water public stands to all leads to overconsumption and wastage. And the technology has now enabled limiting the resource for the intended user beneficiary group. Because of time, I will not say a lot more on this, except that, in a report produced by Veolia, I'll just quote briefly from it, say, in the case of a tap stand, consumers need to be made aware by means of pricing or alert mechanism, which remains to be defined, of the cost of their decision to open a tap for the system as a whole. The alert could be financial in nature or consisting in the introduction of a charge, but it could also consist in creating a sense of scarcity to instill value in the water distributed. So Veolia determines what the value is, not the people who use the water can determine what the value of the water. I will use one more snapshot of another water company called Amandus, which is a subsidiary of Veolia, and launched a program to increase household connection by providing interest-free loans and lines of credit to households in on-the-grid neighborhoods of Tangiers. Now, a survey-based study administered by loan recipients, it's administered by university-based economists involved in the project and funded by Veolia, states that the connection produced happiness. So that kind of, contradicts with what we know about how loans loans produce actually or kind of cause anxiety in households, poor households. But regardless of the happiness claim, the whole point of turning these households from using free public stands was to make them paying consumers. Again, we're talking about the poorest of the poor being brought, coaxed into taking loans to connect on the grid, to make connections on the grid so that they can pay bills to Veolia. So I think, I will not go on and on and on, but we can see these kinds of predation across the region, across the globe, the whole metering, prepaid, and so on is something that is happening in this country. It's happening, also it happened, and there was, water insurgencies across Europe. So, and all of this is in really conformity with globally issued directives of international organizations for rationalization, efficiency, and cost recovery in water use. A kind of very indicative of how widespread this is. The government of Egypt is now very busy installing prepaid water meters with a target of 60 million prepaid water meters to be installed by 2030. And the idea, of course, is if you can't pay, stop using the service. So stop access to water, a basic resource of life, just because you cannot put in the credit. Because of time, I just want to say something about, to just finish on what's happening with the prepaid water meters is, I came across all of these Facebook pages about, the cost of the installation, but also the technical problems of dealing with the meters and so on, and the tariffs and various other things. And there is a lot of struggle that is ongoing now about the disconnection from the grid, for informal neighborhoods, and being forced and coerced to, have this formalized, but also prepaid charges and graduated tariffs and so on. This is really emerging as a zone of struggle. To enforce this also is being enforced and backed up by force. There are kind of water police and municipality officials that are kind of roaming the streets of informal neighborhoods trying to enforce the new regulations. Because of time, I will skip on the housing as an infrastructure of governance, and I will just kind of come to some concluding remarks. I want to conclude with reflections on the analytical and empirical grounds for reframing everyday life politics in terms of struggles for the condition of life and for making livable lives. The reframing aligns with Foucault's proposition that modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. In alignment with Wassim, I shifted analytical focus to ordinary people's struggles for material conditions that are required for physical existence in contexts that put that very existence in question, contexts of neglect and abandonment, dispossession and destruction. I have advanced the proposition that understanding these struggles as concerned with physical persistence does not make them devoid of politics, nor does it place them outside the domain of politics. Rather, in light of the fact that through the differential allocation of worth and legitimacy to the life of vast segments of the population in the global south, it is crucial to examine the concrete terms in which this differentiation is materialized. In other words, the task is to examine the conditions of unlivability and forces and power that create these conditions. Speaking from a moment of destruction in Palestine and of extreme conditions of vulnerability and precarity across many spaces of the MENA, it is also crucial that we approach the struggles for the requirements of life as generative of a politics of life in which physical persistence and the pursuit of lives worth living are intimately linked and mutually constitutive. Thank you.